Welcome to Popcorn Psychology, the podcast where we watch blockbuster movies and psychoanalyze them. My name is Brittany Brownfield, and I'm a child therapist, and I'm joined by
Ben Stover, individual therapist.
Hannah Espinoza, marriage and family therapist.
We're all licensed clinical professional counselors, also known as therapists, who practice out of Chicago. Even though we are licensed mental health professionals, this podcast is purely for entertainment purposes and to fulfill our love of dissecting pop culture in all forms.
Please remember that even though we are all licensed therapists, we aren't your therapist.
If you are struggling with mental health symptoms, please find a local mental health provider.
Hello. So today we are talking about Wes Anderson's movie, Moonrise Kingdom, the first Wes Anderson movie we've ever talked about on this podcast, believe it or not. Before we jump into that, I just wanted to remind everybody that they can find us on Patreon if you would like to, basically help us, support us financially. We're very DIY, so I always appreciate anyone who is willing to become a patron of us. If you are a $50 patron, you can pick a movie that we talk about in an episode, which I think is pretty exciting. We also are just asking everyone if you could review us wherever you listen to us. We've gotten some new reviews recently, which we really appreciated. And so we would just like more of those in the sense that that's how people find us. It's the best way for new people to find us. So right now we're kind of in the top 50 of the film reviews on Apple Podcasts. And we really appreciate it because we know it's you guys that are helping us get there. Like always, you can find us at TeePublic as well if you would like to buy some merch, our little brand on it, and that kind of thing. So that being said, we will jump into the plot of Moonrise Kingdom. So Moonrise Kingdom is one of my favorite movies of all time. Every season we have a couple movies that we force upon the podcast. Like we as the co-hosts are like, these are our personal picks. And Moonrise Kingdom was one of mine. So Moonrise Kingdom it takes place in 1965, and it's about two 12-year-olds, a boy and a girl, who run away together for 10 days or less, according to the girl Suzy. And they, cause a lot of shenanigans after they run away together. And so we're going to be focusing on the two main characters, Suzy and Sam. With Suzy, we're going to be talking about intermittent explosive disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, and also like the parental impact of her presentation in the movie. With Sam, we're going to be talking about the lovely term emotionally disturbed, which get used several times in this movie. We didn't even talk about, was it coping with the very troubled child, which is, I would love to get my eyeballs on that pamphlet that Suzy has as well. With Sam, we'll also talk about the impact of supportive parents after crisis and loss. And then we'll talk, as always, about treatment and final thoughts. So little Miss Suzy, who we see in this movie, I guess in order to lay sort of the groundwork, Suzy comes to us as the oldest of, I think, four. She has three younger brothers, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And her parents are two lawyers who seem to be pretty, would you use the term up their own butts?
I would use exactly that term.
I think I would say up their own asses, but still, same idea.
Hannah swore, but that doesn't count as bingo because she didn't F-bomb it.
That is fair.
Fucking asses.
That is fair. Yeah, exactly.
Sorry to mansplain swearing.
But so Suzy kind of comes on the scene. I guess we could say that her and Sam had met the year prior because he's like a Boy Scout, and he comes out to the island that she lives in every year for like the Boy Scout like Jubilee, I think is what they call it. And so they met the year prior, and they've been sort of pen paling it for a year, and with the plan of next summer when you're here for your Boy Scout shit, we're gonna skadoosh together. We're gonna wander off. And so why does Suzy want to wander off? Because she finds a pamphlet that her parents have called Coping with a Very Troubled Child, on top of just having continuous sort of outbursts at home that are making it very hard for her to live at home.
Some of the other things I think we also see is she's very separated
Well, and that the family seems to be pretty disconnected in general when we see Suzy and when we experience them. The three younger brothers seem to spend time together, but I think that's more about their ages being closer than anything else. I think the youngest are twins.
Oh,
I might be wrong. Did I make that up? I don't know. I feel like the littlest two are actually the same age. I could be wrong. Anyway, doesn't matter.
They do seem pretty young. I would say the youngest seem like 5, 6-ish. I guess.
And they went on a clear path to show a divide between the family in every scene that they were there. That the parents are sleeping in separate beds. The mom only talks to the kids through a megaphone.
And her husband sometimes.
Right, and her husband. The parents are really never in the same space together. No affection is shown towards the children, no reinforcement, no acknowledgement, no recognition, no warmth at all.
Yeah. It doesn't even seem like they care what the kids are doing. It seems like they know they have to feed them. But other than that, it seems like the parents are very much wrapped up in whatever they're experiencing in their life and don't seem to, besides making sure that they eat, it didn't really seem like there were any interactions that were parent-like from what we see.
The mom didn't have, from what we see, we didn't see a single emotionally connected thing happening from either of them, including the mom we saw in 2 different contexts, because even during her breakup with the police chief,
Captain Sharp.
Captain Sharp, played by Bruce Willis, that even in her expressing that she's trying to do better, which was a positive turn, there was absolutely zero concern for his feelings on it. Mm-hmm. No empathy towards him, really. Just like, come on, we'll see each other tomorrow. Just showing absolutely no regard for how others would feel or what their emotional needs are, and responding only to the things that she's supposed to do, and then being really involved in being an attorney. That seems to be what connects her and her husband, is they know each other's cases and they just talk about them dryly. Yeah,
that's what I was going to say, is even her parents refer to each other, I think, as counselor.
They do.
Counselor. And other than that moment at the end when they are having that sort of, I was going to say heart to heart. It was not a heart to heart. They kind of when they sort of break that persona in bed, in their separate twin beds. Other than that, they really only talk to each other about cases, or they go right to the lawyery persona. As soon as when they're on the dock, and as soon as there is an inference made that Suzy assaulted the other person, or that she's out of control, or wherever they put it, they go right into, are you accusing our daughter of a crime? And they put their lawyer hats on very quickly, as almost I would say, an avoidant tactic to deal with the emotional stuff that's going on, which is that you have a daughter who ran away. You didn't notice she ran away for 12 hours or more, maybe longer. And that they just don't deal with that at all. And they go right to a very shut down place, either shut down with their lawyer personas on, or as we see, they, Bill Murray's character, goes out into the woods to get fucked up and chop down trees, and makes a lot, but not just doing that, but also making a big show of it at home, of walking past the kids who are just trying to chill out and not swinging that axe around, but very performative, I guess. I'm going to go chop down trees, his own version, I think, of acting out.
Shirtless.
And I think it's just Wes Anderson's quirky casting, but they are also much older parents to relatively young children, which I think is just Wes Anderson casting the people that he likes in those roles. I don't think it's meant to mean anything in terms of Suzy's presentation to have much older parents. But you could make inferences about that.
He uses the same cast in so many of his movies. I think he just likes the players who understand his sense of humor and can portray characters in the way that he wants, and that he has a troupe that does things the way that he wants.
But in kind of Suzy, so what do we see that's making her seem like a troubled child. And I think kind of the running theme in this movie is that she has big emotional outbursts, which she describes as going berserk is how she kind of references at a few times in the movie. And I'm just going to read off some of the examples that we either see or that she talks about. And they're done kind of like jump cut style, which is, Wes Anderson style. So we only really get, in a lot of the situations, we only really get the actual moment. We don't see a lot of what precipitated it or what happened after the fact. And so punches the mirror. That's what she tells Sam, like one of the first things she tells Sam, because he asks about her hand. And she says, I lost my temper at myself and punched the mirror to the point of hurting herself. She lost the role in the play of Raven because she yelled at her teacher to the extent that she got demoted out of the play. She threw a rock through the window. It seems like maybe at her mom through the window, because then she has to help her mom pick glass out of her mom's hair. She got suspended at school for going berserk on another classmate. And the way that they show that in the movie is that the girl behind her does something I can't even really recall. And then Suzy goes straight from just like arguing back at her to jumping up, pushing their desks out of the way and like kind of going after the girl physically. She does stab a kid with scissors in the movie. And that seemed like they were being attacked by those kids or like it was a high stress situation, though she did stab a kid with scissors. So I just wanted to mention that as well.
I mean, if a bunch of kids comes at me with a spiked club, an axe, and a bow and arrow, among other weapons, knives, whatever else they had, I feel like if I had some scissors, I'm going to cut a bitch too.
Yeah, that's why I'm like, I wanted to mention it, though it doesn't feel like it's in the same vein as the other situations where it seems like she goes, I guess how we would say it in common parlance is she goes from 0 to 60 really quickly. And I think one thing also says a lot is mentions a lot of like shame and regret. It seems like almost immediately after the situation. Like I think she mentioned, I didn't write down, I wrote so many quotes down from this movie, but I didn't write this one down. She mentioned something about that. Like I felt bad, even as I was picking the glass out of my mom's hair, I was already feeling really bad about what I'd done. And so all this kind of behavior sort of reminded me of a diagnosis called intermittent explosive disorder, also kind of called IED, which is ironic considering what that also means as an explosive. It's a diagnosis that I kind of wanted to talk about because it's not very well known. Like I didn't really know it, to be quite honest, until I was in the field and I started working with kids who were getting diagnosed with intermittent explosive disorder. And so I kind of just wanted to, as we like to do sometimes on the podcast, read down sort of what's the criteria for intermittent explosive disorder. So it involves repeated sudden episodes of impulsive, aggressive, violent behavior or angry verbal outbursts to which you react grossly out of proportion to the situation. So that's kind of like the big factor to intermittent explosive disorder is that your reaction does not match the trigger. I think sometimes people think of it like you react for no reason, like you just kind of go berserk, as she says, for no reason, but really you can more often not be triggered. Like road rage that goes out of hand is a good like adult version of intermittent explosive disorder. Episodes can be preceded by or accompanied by rage, irritability, increased energy, racing thoughts, tingling, tremors, palpitations, chest tightness, just because your body is like going into overdrive. The explosive verbal and behavioral outbursts are out of proportion to the situation with no thoughts to consequences and can include temper tantrums, tirades, heated arguments, shouting, slapping, shoving or pushing, physical fights, property damage, threatening or assaulting people or animals. So I think we see a version of that. Like I think we see Suzy do every version of that. Like there's even a scene I forgot to mention where she's screaming at her parents or shouting at them at like what looks like dinner or something. Like she's behind her brothers who are trying to eat and she's like screaming over their shoulders at her parents. It says you may feel a sense of relief or tiredness after the episode. Later, you may feel remorse, regret, or embarrassment. And so it can be caused by environmental factors. I think, like we mentioned before, like most people with this disorder grow up in families with explosive behavior. So it's somewhat normalized. And as we mentioned with like her dad, like I think we see some of that kind of, by the show he puts on of doing that is normalizing kind of inappropriate behavior to your children. Yeah. The risk factors are always could be like physical abuse and other mental health disorders. And I think something too we can talk about is that like it's clear that that's not the only thing. Like if she was given this diagnosis and it really fit once a like therapist sat this person down, if she existed in real life, I think it's also very clear that it's not the only thing going on, that there's also sort of like either it's just the environmental factors, which we'll get into with her parents more, or I think also there could be comorbidity of a mood disorder. In the movie, Sam asks her if she's sad, if she's depressed. And she shrugs. And she also mentions, like she does other things too, like steals the books from the library. And that's not something that would fit under IED. Like that's not anger fueled. That's something more sneaky. Like she said, even the way that she does it, like it's kind of nice to have a secret, which is a very different thing than IED, which is usually so big that it's not thought out and it's not a secret.
No, it's super reactionary. It has to be something that it's a spur of the moment reaction to something that happened that is a nuclear response to a stick fight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I would have to know more about all the contexts, like the situations in which she identifies going berserk. But I would say just going off of what the movie shows me, I definitely feel like she's a kid that could get diagnosed with intermittent explosive disorder, just because of the level. Because also it's interrupting her functioning at school. She got suspended for that one thing. She lost her role in that play. It's impacting her social life, her school life, and now running away is not related. It's also she's doing a lot of things where she even admits, like, I'm not thinking about sort of the consequences of it, or not really thinking about it in the moment when I'm throwing it, what I'm going into a race. So I just kind of wanted to point that out. It's an interesting kids do get diagnosed with, especially if they're at sort of the level that I worked at, which is like partial hospital programs, because a lot of kids who go there, more often than not, it's because they're struggling to maintain in school in some way. And so sometimes it is for these reasons we're seeing with Suzy, and that the school really can't handle them. Like in the situation where she goes after that girl in class, that's terribly unsafe. And it's like jeopardizing the other kids, unfortunately. And then we never want to like make a kid feel othered and be like, you have to leave the classroom because you're scaring all the other kids. She is doing that. And I think this is me making a leap because she doesn't necessarily say that. She does. I think in the way that she presents and the shame she talks about after these things is, I feel like I can tell she's a kid that doesn't like how she's making other people feel with the behavior that she's doing. It seems like she has an awareness that maybe I'm just reading into, that she's like scaring people and like scaring herself probably too, which is also is scary for everybody involved with the IED, is that it can also scare the kid in question. Of like, I lose it and I just can't seem to control myself.
I think you make good points. I just want to point out to everybody that the background noise you heard just a second ago was a dog yawn and was not a fart.
I didn't even hear it.
For anybody who's going to comment on that or leave a review that they leave fart sounds in their podcast, that was a dog yawn. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think it's important to point out that looking at the changes in behaviors that we see, we don't have a time frame of how long that they've been emerging for with her. She appears the same age in all of these, and they could be happening during the same year. And I think that it's definitely important to point out that there's a difference between what might be the correct diagnosis and what diagnosis might get made. Mm-hmm. Or someone might be having to struggle with as they work on getting a provider to communicate properly with their parents what might be needed to help resolve the behaviors. And if it's what is likely to happen with this kid is the parents and the school are going to go, this kid is a problem, and nobody's going to look at what's going on at home or talk to the kid about it. Particularly, the range of mental health services available in the 60s, it was very different than it is now.
Mm-hmm. Very different.
Yeah. And I think anecdotally, when I've worked with kids that have been slapped with an IED diagnosis, it's usually from a pretty, like you're saying, Ben, I haven't loved the vibe, I guess is what I'm going to say, because it's been very much, well, that kid has that problem. Like you're saying, like that kid's a problem child. They have an anger issue. That I think the way it's talked about in my experience, like anecdotally, is that this kid just has this problem and we're not going to think about all the factors that are going into it. We just need to get a way to calm this kid the fuck down so he can like not be such a big pain in the ass for everybody.
I think that is part of what I've seen as well. But I want to add to it is that the other thing that I have seen is that it becomes a diagnosis that can be used for billing purposes that can get these kids the services they need that insurance companies will approve, which is its own game.
Well, that's also a good point and kind of goes into the idea of like ODD. Oppositional defiant disorder is another diagnosis that I could see Suzy getting diagnosed with as well. And in my experience, this might be different because I haven't had to deal with this specifically in several years. But I know back when I used to work at a PHP, ODD could not be the primary diagnosis that we gave a kid because insurance would not pay for it. So you're right in that if I gave intermittent explosive disorder, there might be a better chance of services rendered being actually paid for.
Maybe. I think IED is probably another one that would fall under similar, but ODD definitely can't be the primary because you're right, they won't pay for it. And while that wouldn't be a concern in the 60s yet, the reality that seeing people having to navigate diagnosis and what's covered and what's not as part of their reality when they're struggling with behaviors that are obviously causing disruption in multiple areas of life, as well as causing problems for the parents and causing problems in the school system, especially when one kid is starting to show aggressive behaviors at other kids, because then the other parents are going to step in and be like, what is happening to my child?
Yeah.
And that matters because that's going to cause pressure on the system to get something done quick, to get something done immediately, and to get this kid in services. And a lot of times when we see these kinds of things, it's in residential settings where I used to work, where I would see this, or with people who have severe chronic mental illnesses that are in day programs or intensive outpatient level things where they're going to be in intensive outpatient services. Intensive outpatient are programs where there are usually a mix of group and individual services in both class and therapy forms offered to people who are going through struggles that not necessarily chronic mental illness, but anyone can access this level of care. And sometimes people need to, where they provide a couple hours, a couple times a week, or a few hours, several days a week of services where they can go to a facility and receive some services without the need to be hospitalized, but that their needs greatly exceed what is able to be done in a 1 hour session of counseling.
And just kind of touching upon like what makes me personally as a clinician kind of veer away from oppositional defiant disorder when talking about Suzy is she does fit some of the criteria. You know, often and easily loses temper, often angry and resentful, argumentative with adults or people of authority. I think what feels different to me, and you guys can let me know if you don't agree with me for sure, is that it doesn't seem like it's coming out of like a vindictive or spiteful place, which is another criteria part of it. And it also doesn't seem like she's just trying to break rules for rules' sake, or it's not specifically to authority figures. It kind of goes like across the board. And I also would say end ODD can happen. If you have mild ODD, it's just happening in one setting, like homeschool work. If you have moderate, it's occurring at least two settings. And if it's severe, it's happening everywhere. And so if she were to get slapped with it, she probably would get moderate because it's happening at home and at school, maybe even severe because it happened at that play and like so during extracurricular activities. But I think with Suzy, it doesn't seem like she's wanting to just break rules or she's just arguing with adults and having a problem with them. And she doesn't seem to, other than like the book stealing, doesn't seem to get satisfaction from the incident, which I don't say like ODD kids necessarily, like kids with ODD don't necessarily get vindictive satisfaction. I would say that she just doesn't present in the kind of similar way. I think intermittent explosive seems like it fits her better, because also the level of intensity in which she kind of explodes. And I think how we see her in the movie, which I think is what's tough about that, is we're seeing her in a moment when she's out of the setting. She's away from her parents in her home setting, which seems to be very triggering for her. And she's also kind of living in this fantasy realm with this boy that she has been having this like friendship/romance with. Like she's being able to live in the fantasy that she reads about all the time. And so I think we're also seeing a version of her that is not typical or in a typical setting, if that makes sense.
I don't know that I agree. I think there's validity to that, but I think that what is not being considered in looking at that is that I don't know that she's being deliberately vindictive, but we're seeing that she's obviously being neglected and crying out for attention.
Mm-hmm.
So I think not seeing her in a typical thing is like, not that I disagree with, I don't think she has oppositional defiant necessarily. I think that this honestly has a lot more to do with that she's being chronically ignored by her parents at a developmental stage that is fucking difficult. If you can find me a meaner creature on the earth than a 12-year-old girl, followed very, very shortly by a 12-year-old boy, I don't think you could prove it to me, because junior high kids are awful to each other all the time. They're just
your hormones
awful.
And you're just trying to figure out who you are. And it seems like everything you're doing is wrong. And
your feelings are so big. And your feelings are so big.
Yeah, you just got them yesterday.
The messy.
And I think you're bringing up the third very powerful component of this, which is the home life, which we sort of talked about. And that's what would make me as a clinician, I would be very thoughtful of the diagnosis I would give Suzy, because like you're saying, there's so many environmental factors happening. And you're right. She is a kid who's seems to be being chronically ignored by her parents. And so when that happens, you make big moves sometimes to get your needs met, which can be what she's doing. Like, you're not listening to me unless I shout.
I mean, they're not listening to her at all. And seeing that is an important part of making a diagnosis with anybody, is that if you're going to look at or not look at the home life, it gets really easy to scope somebody in and go, well, they meet that check, that check, that check, that check, that check. Yeah, it's this. But if we look at the home life of, I think, Hannah, you were saying big feelings. I don't know which one of you said they just got them yesterday, but right. You just got them yesterday. 12-year-olds try to mimic the behavior of adults, but they just 100% miss on what the purpose of the adult behavior is. And they mimic incorrectly because they don't have the cognitive or behavioral capacity to understand. And I think that's a lot of what we see by all of the kids in this movie, all over it. Is they try to mimic what looks cool or just what they've learned vicariously, and then try to start auditioning those responses with real stimuli and just miss, because that's what kids do. But looking at a person without understanding the impact of their home life ignores that a lot of the kids that legitimately have oppositional defiant disorder show it regardless of how much love they're shown, regardless of how much structure they're given, regardless of how many opportunities to work through things, that it is a disorder that truly ignores all of that. And of course, there's going to be things going on at home when there's a child struggling with something difficult. But it seems almost like the origination of it comes out of nowhere. Whereas when we see something like this, like, we know her mom is having an affair, which means she's more emotionally unavailable. She's sneaking out at times when she may have had those little moments of connection that are really when you form close emotional bonds with parents, is the little moments where they come in and poke their head into your room at 12, not little kids, but at 12, when you have those little talks while somebody's brushing their teeth or somebody's reading a book, or they just pop in to check in on you or see something. I guarantee mom is missing those moments with her because she's out doing whatever she's doing.
Well, and a part of what we see and find out about Suzy is she knows about the affair.
Yeah, she caught him with her binoculars.
So she knows about the affair, which means her mother gets to do what she wants. And she also is experiencing, I mean, if we think about intermittent explosive disorder, oftentimes, and maybe not always, but that the kids experience some kind of abuse. So a lot of the things that you were describing, I was thinking, what is that all related to? Trauma. Like, all of those different reactions would be to somebody who has experienced trauma. And I think the other thing that we see is Suzy, her father throws a shoe at the master sergeant's master scout. He takes off his fucking shoe and throws it at him.
Yeah,
he throws his shoe at him.
Same shit. Yeah.
he starts attacking them until, so the father is showing her, she's modeling her father in a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a part of what you're both saying is that giving a kid a diagnosis who's 12 and one that we know will follow them through the system is not helpful if we don't have all the information that we need. So making sure that, and I don't know if, parents out there can attest to this, but I know that parents that I work with who have kids who have different kinds of struggles of all kinds, that a part of what we have to do is we have to talk to the school, we have to talk to all these people and make sure that they're aware. And first to get information. We want to get information about what they're like at school. We want to get information about what they're like at home. And then we want to get, information from the kid, which I think in the 60s was definitely not something that they gave a shit about. And it was a lot more about talking to the parents and not that parents aren't allowed to make decisions for their kids, but more of not getting any information from the child at all about what might be going on, because it really seems like it's neglect. She's being neglected. She's being ignored. And when she can't stand it anymore, she acts out. And then the impact that has on the family, because we also see the three boys, I feel like they actually react to things even less than the adults do. Because I think that they're just trying to get through it. Which is why I feel like I don't even remember their names. I don't remember hearing their little voices very much. I think a part of that, the movie even ignores those other kids.
They're just not really pivotal to the story that's being told. So they're kind of just like accessories.
Yeah.
But I hear what you're saying in that when we do see them, which could just be Wes Anderson quirkiness, they almost come off as little old men. Like they just take care of themselves and they entertain themselves, which is very a way of parenting, which is, having your kids entertain themselves. And I would also wager that their parents are very hooked into their reputation. So I also think a part of it too with her parents is just kind of the avoidance of her too, is I don't really want to acknowledge that I have a child that's out of hand and that might be my fault. So I'm going to do things like get a pamphlet that calls her trouble that can kind of help us as parents, not take ownership of what we might be doing that is impacting this. Because like you said, Hannah, when Bill Murray's character threw that shoe at that scoutmaster, my first thought was how many times in sessions I have told parents, you cannot ask your child to behave better than the parents at home or the adults around them. It's deeply unfair. And this happens maybe not way more than you'd think. It happens probably exactly as often as you think. How many times I worked with a family where the parents can come in with a laundry list of the shit that they're doing that is not okay and they need to stop. And then when I poke around with the family more, they are doing a lot of those behaviors. And so then it's an uncomfortable conversation, but necessary to say to the parents, we have to be acutely aware of the behaviors that we're modeling at home. And if we are not even necessarily reinforcing the behavior we want to go away, but are we even modeling the behavior we want to see? Because if you're showing your child the only way to deal with a stressor is to get aggressive, why are you surprised that they get aggressive? Or if you're showing that, you can't also do that thing of what do they say? Do what I say, not as I do, or whatever the version of that is, which is so deeply unfair as well. And like you're saying, Hannah, she catches her mom. And that's one of the first things she calls her mom out on when she comes back home and they're at that bathtub scene. And she's like, you're fucking around. She doesn't say it like that, but you're taking advantage of that poor, sad policeman. And so fuck you, pretty much.
So when I was realizing we do get some time frame on our behavior because of the letters, that the letters have been going on for a year.
Yeah.
So as we're talking about this, I think one of the things that I want to point out is that as we're going through this and talking about intermittent explosive disorder and the conduct issues that go along with that, along with the conduct issues that go along with oppositional defiant disorder, that the diagnosis I think that I would give to this child, knowing her whole history and looking at it, would be adjustment disorder with mixed disturbance of emotions and conduct.
Yeah, I think that's the fairest diagnosis. And I bet you it's the last one she would get, unfortunately.
I agree because in the 60s, she wouldn't get it at all because it probably didn't exist.
Yeah.
But,
In the 60s, they say she had
troubled.
or they say she had schizophrenia. They just told people that they had that.
and did lobotomies because, that's the thing.
Yeah. like the 60s.
Looking at that, looking at this in context, it feels like inappropriate to give this child that diagnosis when we know that there's that much going on at home that's going to influence her behavior. Mm-hmm. Does that mean they shouldn't be listed as rule outs, considered for further examination, depending on how her behavior continues to develop once some of those things start to resolve or get addressed? Mm-hmm. No, they're absolutely things that should be listed as what we call a rule out, or we don't have enough to give you this diagnosis, but we have enough that we need to list in our documentation that we are considering this.
We're thinking about it.
We're thinking about it. We're evaluating you for this, but right now we're not giving you this. But also there are behaviors that are unexplained by other things. But when you look at adjustment disorder, it means that something happened that caused these behaviors. There is a marked shift and change in a person's life. And with Suzy, we see that this starts when she discovers her mom having this affair. And you find me one kid, particularly back then, that's not afraid of their parents getting divorced. Mm-hmm. And tell me that, Hannah used a magic word of say hello to trauma, ladies and gentlemen.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what that meant back then.
Yeah.
I mean, from the teeny tiny town that they're from, like that, you could be ostracized from the entire city. Getting divorced is not something that, good people, whatever the fuck that even means, do at that time.
Good families didn't get divorced.
Well, and if we think about it, Ben, I think that's a really great point. And also I was just thinking about in terms of her mother is doing whatever she wants. Her dad also definitely does whatever he wants. And seems like he feels like everybody needs to know about it, even though no one is asking. And then she finds out that her mom is having an affair. And it's like, well, I guess it doesn't matter what I do. Or she just gets so upset and just doesn't know what to do with all that energy and that all those feelings, because they're so big that she has, that they come out in arguments at school or yelling at her parents, which probably is totally... I wish we could have heard what she was saying, because I bet some of it is, you never listen to me. You don't even notice when I'm here. You don't understand and you don't care.
And you never will. Yeah, for sure. And I think one kind of piggybacking on this, and why when you get to know, especially child clients and teenage clients, but all ages, is the way that she talks about the books that she likes. And how I like books with a girl who gets to go on adventures and basically leave the space that she's in and is special and powerful and gets to go on an adventure. And every book she reads, she even says is in that theme. And so that's why it's important when you're working with all clients, but especially kids and teenagers, to really ask them questions that might not seem clinically relevant, because you learn a lot about them. And so even that way she described those books would give me a lot of intel as a therapist about her home environment, how her needs are getting met or not met, what her needs are, period. And I think that was very telling. And that's why, like I said, why it's important to talk about those things as a child therapist, if you're going to work with anybody, but especially kids.
Yep. I think I don't have anything else on Suzy right now. I mean, we could probably talk about her for an entire show, but I think we covered it pretty good.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't even really get into the book stealing thing and all the stuff she says about that. But I think that would be something that would lead to more questions as a therapist and more things you'd probe into to figure out, what does it mean to have a secret? Why do you like that? What do you get out of stealing? But very in a non-judgmental way, just because you're getting to know her more. And yeah, we can definitely wrap up on Suzy and then jump into Sam. But before that, we'll take a break. So our lovely darling Sam, who I think gets introduced in the movie as emotionally disturbed. So what does that mean, everybody?
Ooh.
When the term emotionally get disturbed gets used, which unfortunately still gets used.
It does. And I remember when I took my first job in the mental health field, it was at a school for children with emotional disturbance. So I pulled up the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, which defines emotional disturbance as the following: a condition exhibiting one or more of the following characteristics over a long period of time and to a marked degree that adversely affects a child's educational performance, including an inability to learn that cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors, an inability to build or maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers, inappropriate types of behavior or feelings under normal circumstances, a general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, a tendency to develop physical symptoms or fears associated with personal or school problems. And it is specific to note that they said, as defined with IDEA, emotional disturbance includes schizophrenia, but does not apply to children who are socially maladjusted unless it's determined that they have an emotional disturbance. So why this is important to mention is it essentially becomes a catch-all term that offers a non-specific, non-actionable term that means something is going on with the kid. We don't really have the ability to define it. And oftentimes it's used by schools to say we can't help this child here. And they have to work to find them other more appropriate services, be it through a therapeutic day school or a residential program. But the path to getting services like that is brutal. Oftentimes, parents have to go through struggle after struggle after struggle, and it takes many months to years in order to get someone the services they need when given diagnoses like these, or not diagnoses, but this term is used. And I understand why it exists, but also have some pretty profound disagreements because of the non-specific nature of it and the stigmatizing nature of it. But that's what it means.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I feel like, Ben, what you were listing off is the reaction that any child would have to experiencing trauma. Mm-hmm. But trauma is not mentioned anywhere in the description that you gave.
No, it's not. And as I'm sitting here and reading this, I'm going like Bruce Wayne, Bruce Wayne, Bruce Wayne, Bruce Wayne, Bruce Wayne. Mm-hmm. And most of the adult men that I've met in my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm gonna make sure I'm gonna be balanced with my attacks today. Of 12-year-old girls are mean, but also we're gonna talk about them. Let's talk about adult men for a second here, because we got some issues.
Yes,
all of them, all the issues,
all of the issues. We'll just own that, all the issues. Mm-hmm. But looking at that, like, right? You're right, Hannah. It's just like, boop, there it is. Mm-hmm. Deal with it.
And I think this movie and the character of Sam is a great example of how that label, once it gets stuck on you, fucks you up more than probably the things that got you that label, in the sense that, like I said, almost immediately, this is how he's described when they call his foster parents. They're like, well, he's emotionally disturbed. It's not fair to the others. And like the other kids at the Boy Scout camp are like, well, he's emotionally disturbed. He's a whack job. He's crazy. Like, they use a lot of not kind terms. And that is unfortunately what happens, is that this term horribly others the children who get labeled with it. Mm-hmm. And then, like you're saying, Ben, it is a catch-all. So there's no context for what it really means for that specific kid. And so it allows the people around them to dump also everything that they're dealing with into that pile with the kid. So there's no thoughtfulness around, like you were mentioning, Hannah, the fact that he lost his parents pretty tragically and very suddenly with a car accident, that he's been in foster homes and other placements, that he's clearly going through trauma responses. Like he mentions he wets the bed, sleepwalking, unfortunately lighting fires while he sleeps. And for a diagnosis that should hopefully be giving compassion, it gets treated as almost like a behavioral thing too. It's they're almost being talked about like he's choosing to be emotionally disturbed.
I was going to just cut in for a second. I was thinking about how they make it seem like it's intentional. Like he's intentionally sleepwalking. He's intentionally wetting the bed. He's intentionally, and none of that shit is true. That's not what's happening at all. But that's what that labeling them as that makes it seem like that's what's true about them, that they have the awareness of what they're doing and they do it anyway.
Or that the things that are happening to them happened without context, or the reason, or like you said, like the reasons for their behaviors have no context. Like they're just a broken kid. And I don't care for that term and the stigma it carries with it. Mm-hmm. Because while the term used by professionals to explain categorical behaviors like I listed earlier and going like, these kids are having these problems and they're an expansive array of things that are causing destruction and disruption in their lives everywhere, and something needs to be done to get them help. I understand the use of it, but when it carries beyond people who understand that that is a secondary label that is not in place of a diagnosis, people then start using it as an explanation, which basically creates the way these other kids treat him of, well, he's just a crazy kid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then nobody helps him or tries to connect to him or shows him compassion. Instead, they ostracize him.
Mm-hmm. And then it's that horrible feedback loop. Then it becomes the chicken or the egg of like, does he have no friends because he can't make any friends because he's quote unquote emotionally disturbed? Or does he not have friends because everyone in the camp knows that he's emotionally disturbed and so no one wants to hang out with him? Mm-hmm. And so that's also what's so, you have to be very careful with this kind of stuff, and why we were like, even when we were talking about Suzy, being mindful of what you're throwing on kids, because it can get around. It allows, and adults will judge them. Well, in the movie, we see that happening a lot with the social worker, with who they just call, what do they call it? Just like social services.
Social services.
Hold on, social services. And his foster parents and all that stuff is just, they've decided who he is. Mm-hmm. And that's just who he is. And I think what is an interesting juxtaposition in the movie is that he's actually demonstrating in the movie a lot of thoughtfulness, empathy, compassion, carefulness, like the way he plans the trip, the way he's using all his scouting knowledge, the way he attends to Suzy. He's demonstrating a lot of behaviors that are actually kind of fly in the face somewhat of that label. And that if people gave him space, which you see Edward Norton's character do, that he actually has a lot of attributes, like positive attributes that indicate to us, obviously, as clinicians, that he's not just this kid who's running around acting bananas, as they might say in the movie. It's very much clearly a reaction to stuff that's going on around him.
Yeah, well, of course it's a reaction. Like, he's not safe anywhere. So I know we used the language of parts activity before. Like, in what universe is this kid's fight part not going to come out and be overdeveloped? One of the ways I've been trying to explain this to people who've never heard parts before is, for those of us that are nerds and have played any kind of role-playing video or tabletop game, is that every character comes with an array of stats, and that the more you use those stats, the more they get developed. And the things that make the role-playing games that people have been playing for a long time, like Dungeons and Dragons or even Skyrim, any of the Bethesda type games, is that people have the ability to play the game however works for them, and people operate life the same way. They use the skills that they have and they start to develop them. And this kid has learned that he can connect to people in certain ways, and in other ways he cannot. And that he's going to invest in the things that he has to. And then to protect himself, he learns, I'm either going to draw a line and let you know if you cross this line, I'm going to shoot you, or he's going to get beat up.
Yeah.
So he develops those skills. We see this kid work through that over and over again, and it looks like trauma responses that his fight part is just overactivated. It's been overdeveloped, and then he stays kind of shut down in between periods of when he needs to activate so that he can conserve enough energy to operate the dangerous situations he knows he's going to come across because he's going to get cast out, beat up, targeted, shamed, or told he can't live here anymore. So it's just not working out. Social services is going to come get you in the morning. So why would he invest in anyone or anywhere?
He's a kid that only has himself to depend on. And we see that in this movie because he runs away. And he leaves a very thoughtful letter resigning from the Scouts. And so he's being thoughtful and calculated, but in like a positive way, resourceful. And yeah, you're right. He has decided, understandably, I'm just going to take care of myself.
Because why wouldn't he? Why would he not decide that? If I have worked with a great many kids that would have decided exactly the same thing had they gotten an ounce of opportunity to do so. And it doesn't surprise me at all to see him do that. And I think when Hannah went like, it's like screaming it from the mountaintop. It's a trauma response.
Well, and I know that we were trying to figure this out before we started recording, which is how old was Sam when his parents died? And I think because his age, because he's so young, he's only 12. And so even if we say his parents died 4 years ago, he was only 8.
Yeah.
So when we lose a primary caregiver or both of our primary caregivers at that young of an age, that would then be considered like an attachment wound. So also their ability to feel safe or even want to think about connecting to other people would be pretty closed down, shut down because of all the things that they've experienced. And also because he's continuously being, I don't know, free traumatized is too big of a word to say, but that's kind of what it feels like keeps happening to him. Because I'm thinking about the fact that he's been to, I remember them mentioning 4 foster homes. So if he has been in 4 foster homes, then that means that all of them got rid of him for some reason. So you lose your parents. You don't have anyone who can take you for whatever reason. Maybe there's no other family. Maybe there's nobody close. We don't know, right? That's all the stuff we don't know. It might just be movie magic. That would be something that we would find out. So he has lost his parents unexpectedly, been put into the system, has already been in the system for 4 years. The chances of that would be a re-traumatization every time he got ripped out and got sent to another place, which is just reinforcement that there is a problem, and the problem is me and who I am and what I am. And that emotionally disturbed bullshit would be following him around, just the way that we see that it does, which is also the way that it happens for kids that I think both of you have worked with.
It would, and I have seen it both work for and against people in the ways that we're talking about. In the 60s, it would have worked largely against them. And that's why the place that I worked at came to be somewhere around then. Looking at the realities that these things would work against people because they would start getting that label in that little file that they kept talking about. Social services kept alluding to, and then the Scoutmaster was also alluding to, oh, that wasn't in your file, is every home that he was going to get sent to, every foster house, every single placement would then know that he had emotional disturbance and create a preconceived notion of him, as opposed to doing the thing that Bruce Willis, and I'm assuming Bruce Willis is just going to be Bruce Willis in every movie that I talk about. But Bruce, what is his name? Captain what?
Sharp, I think is what
Captain Sharp. Yeah, when Captain Sharp sat down with him and talked to him.
Yeah.
He was the only person until the Scoutmaster got out of his own butt that showed him an ounce of like human empathy besides Suzy. And looking at that, it stuck out to me that I guarantee none of the adults who look at that file and saw emotionally disturbed child in his file gave him an ounce of patience, and that the second it looked like it wasn't going to work out, they went, someone else's problem.
Yeah. Well, and I would also say, and I think the movie was making a point with when they showed that foster home that he just came from, is that was like looked like a foster mill. Like it was a bunch of boys staying in a bunch of bunk beds. And for whatever reason, which they don't give us any more clarity on, he is the only one wearing different clothes. Like he's wearing like a dirty work jumpsuit, and the rest of them have like clean white t-shirts and what looks like clean, nice jeans. So he's been ostracized in the way that he's dressed. He's also, in the scenes we watch, the only one doing chores, and everyone else is just watching him. So kind of ironically with how he's discussed in the movie is when we see him, other than the sleepwalking, lighting fires, he is like a well-behaved, doing his chores while being pretty ostracized, it seems, from the little clips we get. And that is also something to be mindful of. Like there's, like I've dealt with a lot of foster families. Some foster parents are, you know, angel sent from heaven, and some aren't. And I think that there's a lot of mixed experiences, to say it very mildly, about foster care and being a part of foster care, and the reasons why people get into foster care. Some people make good money being foster parents, and foster parents in the way that we're kind of seen in the movie, where they are like collecting children in a way.
Yeah.
And once a kid, and they don't have I would imagine, just what I saw there is those people didn't have the time or the energy or the want to work through whatever Sam was needing. And he was even saying, like, I tried to tell them it was an accident. They didn't believe me. And he even says to Suzy, like, I think we're finally starting to feel like a real family, at the same time that they're booting him.
Yeah.
And you could even say, in the way that they dismiss him from their home, is like, we sent him, I don't know, a letter to let him know they are also treating him as if he doesn't give a shit about their relationship. Like, this is all business to Sam too, which is deeply unfair. No 12-year-old thinks like that. And it says a lot, I think, about either these foster parents really didn't know what they were getting into by taking him in, or they thought, I don't know, that they could, some people feel this way, especially in the 60s, that they could like structure it out of him.
Yeah.
Like if we give this kid, I think something that comes up a lot when deciding to be a foster parent is you have to be ready for whatever comes at you. And if you're not prepared for that, you have to make sure, because you can also, as a foster parent, you can differentiate if you can work with kids who have emotional problems, if we're going to think of it like that. And so you have to be trained in that. And you have to, like, nowadays, probably not in the 60s. In the 60s, they're probably like, oh, you're willing to take a kid in? Thank you for taking this child off of our hands, government. Like, that would be the government. But you just have to know what you're doing. And you could just, I don't know. It really pissed me off seeing the pictures of him in that place, because it's like, that was like basically a group home that they were pretending was a family home.
Yep. And I think the only advantage of people getting these diagnoses, because I know we talked about kind of there's two sides of it, is that nowadays, eventually, that they can get in, or not, that this is not a diagnosis, but getting this kind of categorization is that it can help them eventually get to the right place.
Yeah.
Where the right people who know what to do and can have the right patience and right expectations of, this is going to take some difficulty, but that, I'll get into this in treatment, so I won't do it now, but looking at a relational based approach is what needs to be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And exactly what you were talking about, like these kids aren't going to show you everything that they're thinking, because they're chronically hypoaroused and alternate with periods of their fight response going haywire, because they've had to survive a bunch of really bad shit happening to them. And they may feel differently than they display, and they're going to feel it for a long time before they communicate it, especially closeness, because it's too scary. Mm-hmm. And tragically with Sam, we see these parents that he feels like are starting to be a real family. He probably hasn't told them that.
Yeah.
And they probably don't know. And it might have changed that their behavior, saying he can't come back. But that's not what happened. And it's often not what happens to kids like this, is that by the time they find somebody that they're comfortable, they're gain comfortability with, something happens. And then because they've got a label, they get dismissed too soon, when another kid might have been shown more deference and patience.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's also that thing of, you should expect that a kid like Sam will have stumbling points, if we're going to think of it like that. And you have to be ready to see him through those. And so also it's like the deeply unfair dynamic of if you make a mistake, if you act out, if you have a hard day and do something you regret, you will not just be punished for it, like appropriately, like as a kid, but you will be sent away. You will be no longer lovable by me. So what you're continuing to communicate to these kids is the ability for the world to love you and to care about you and to take care of you is entirely contingent upon being perfect. And if you slip up in any way, that will all be taken from you. And so if you really think about it, when everyone listens, you really think about all the people in your life that you know love you no matter what. And imagine those people disappeared or never existed. That's what it feels like to live in the world like these kind of kids, is to not have that foundational stability, or at least foundational belief of no matter what, someone loves me unconditionally and will take care of me unconditionally. These kids don't have that. Possibly. To reiterate that by rehoming kids, and then in the situation where he's going to be in, where he gets sent to a juvenile refuge, as they say, which is what a colorful way to say orphanage. Now we've given up. We've given up even trying to find a parent who could put up with him. Mm-hmm. So God bless in this movie, goddess bless, whatever, that he has those two dads, which I kept calling him when I was watching the movie, Ed Norton's character and Bruce Willis's character. Ed Norton, he does a fantastic job. I even made a TikTok about this like months ago on our TikTok at Popcorn Psychology. Like that scene where he gets found, where Suzy and Sam get found and they're in his tent and Ed Norton goes in there. And his first thing I think he says is, I didn't know you were an orphan, because they didn't tell him. And then he immediately takes it back and he goes, we don't have, like basically says, like, we don't have to, I'm sorry to ask that. Like, we don't have to talk about that. So I think what I love is he does this really good job of, one, respecting Sam's autonomy and boundaries, which I'm sure nobody is when you're a kid like Sam. Two, then he gives him positive regard and praise. You know, I wish I could have done basically like an evaluation, an inspection of your tent area, because that's one of the best camping things I've ever seen. So giving him praise, like, I'm still thinking well of you, even though you just broke a lot of rules, which that's very powerful. And then he asks him, like, you don't want to be a khaki scout anymore? So then he goes in with can you help me understand what's going on? And that was like a masterful 3-beat thing that I was really impressed by as a child therapist. And I'm really glad that Sam got that moment with Ed Norton's character.
Yeah, that was really healing, because the way I put it is up his own butt. You phrased it much better. Is he was stuck in a role, right? He was playing a role, and he was imitating probably the way that the Harvey Keitel Scoutmaster was behaving, which is very militaristic.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And Boy Scouts, I was a Boy Scout for a while. Boy Scouts was not militaristic at all, but this version of khaki scouts very much was. Having people fall in and
very boot campy.
Yeah, dude, weird vibes. Remind me to come back to my thoughts on Boy Scouts and final thoughts, but the way that he kind of idolized him, and obviously had his photo next to him, we could see that he was caught up in a role and trying to emulate, and that when he got back into his math teacher self out of that role and apologized to this child, we saw him do what a lot of trauma things would call a life space interview, where after the crisis, you sit down and have a conversation in a non-judgmental, non-directive way, where you ask the questions, but you give space, you give deference, and that you display unconditional positive regard, that regardless of what you say or why what happened, we're here to understand it. I'm not here to judge you, and I'm not here to shame you, but I want to know what caused this and what went on. And let's talk about it. And if that's, the decision you want to make, then that's cool. I'm not going to pressure you to join us. I just want to understand what's going on for you. And he did a great job of that.
And he was asking open-ended questions, what and how questions, and not why. Right? Like how different would we see that going if he had walked in and said, why did you leave? What were you thinking? How could you do this? Like, there's so many different ways that conversation could have gone. And I think it was just a really beautiful exchange that they had. And it makes me wonder how long it had been since Sam had had any grown up act like that towards him.
Yeah. And then he's very lucky in that it's kind of like in a 1-2 punch in a positive way. He then goes to stay with Bruce Willis's character, who he also does a fantastic job over that dinner he makes him. Very bachelor dinner. I think it was like a piece of white bread and a hot dog.
Yeah.
That's it. And
and don't forget a beer.
And he validates his feelings. He says that makes total sense why you felt that way. He says something along those lines.
Yeah.
And he really talks to Sam with a lot of respect, almost like a peer, but in an appropriate way. And he also brings up like himself of like, you know, I do things. He says something along those basically like I made mistakes too. And he does say, which I wrote down, it takes time to figure things out. Like really affirming for him that, you know, everybody makes mistakes and that sometimes we make decisions because we don't know what we're doing yet, or we don't really know how to do it. And that conversation too is that was very positive for me watching as a child therapist of like you were saying, Ben, very non-judgmental, very inclusive conversation, very open-ended, more of like a dialogue, not trying to like interrogate him, which he easily could have done. Very just like, oh man, like that's tough. And, you know, I've done stupid shit too. And like, that makes sense why you made those decisions. And I think that's so vital too. And this is what I tell parents a lot is you have to remember that anything we do in life is we're trying to get a need met. And so if we can come at it from that perspective, it helps us gain a lot of empathy for things we don't quite understand. Why did you do that? Well, what need could that child been trying to get met by that behavior? Like we've talked about with Suzy and with Sam. And I think the way that Bruce Willis is talking to him and even like Edward Norton's character is talking to him is more trying to figure out what's the underlying thing going on that's just coming out in these behaviors. We get so caught up in the surface, like what happened, that we don't think about why it happened. It's like, don't get caught up on content, think more about context. And that I think we're seeing a lot very beautifully in his conversations with these two guys, which I think was so powerful, made me feel so good for Sam. And then the fact that he goes on to live with Bruce Willis, I think says a lot. It made me feel very hopeful for him. And yeah, like you said, Ben, it was very healing interactions watching both of those.
Well, and in particular, watching Captain Sharp step up and go, he's not going to one of those homes.
Yeah. And watching him kind of fight for him.
Because also one of the things that I think we don't know Captain Sharp's history or anything about him, but remembering that people who are in law enforcement see everything from everyone and know something that the rest of us don't, which is that most civilians that aren't in healthcare, unfortunately, us mental health professionals know the same things they do. And anybody who's a nurse or a doctor or anything similar is that the world is not safe and that terrifying things strike everyone, regardless of socioeconomic status. Sure, there's some things that are protective factors and it hits poor people and disadvantaged people more, but the people who work in any kind of capacity like that don't have this veil of innocence or this veil idea that society protects you and see through the bullshit and know that no, not everything is the way it is, and look at things with an air of informed cynicism. And that his character was very accurately doing that, of going, hold on, social services. You're representing your agency as, oh, the child will be cared for. You're like, you're not even talking about him like a person. And you're not sending him to one of those homes because he knew exactly what those places were. Because he's seen them.
He's like juvenile refuge, like the way that he's like, he cuts right through, like, what does that even mean?
And I guarantee you, as his work in a police office, being a police officer, he's been called to them or had to take people to them or had to take people out of them or had to respond to sexual abuse calls from them. He knows the truth about them. And to see him kind of make that step to go, this kid is not doing that. This kid does not need that, was tremendous. And I wish that could happen for more people like this poor kid, Sam. Yeah,
that's the movie part of this, unfortunately, the cinematic tidiness of that. Because also I think what's really powerful about Ed Norton's character and Bruce Willis's character, and I don't think Sam ever really witnesses that, but how much they fight for him, and how if he got to see maybe even a little bit of that, how powerful that would be for Sam to see adults fight for him. It's not always appropriate. Like, kids don't have to see adults fighting literally in this movie with the shoes and stuff. And I think even at the moment where he's coming home with me, that would be a very powerful moment for a kid like Sam to say, like, someone gives a shit. That's really what it is someone gives a shit, not just even gives a shit, but gives enough of a shit to put themselves in pair to like let me into their life. And so, yeah, I really love all of that. So I know one thing that we were going to mildly touch upon, just because they say it and we're, therapists talking about the therapy parts of movies, is they do mention electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, a few times. And in the context of this movie, they're using it seems like, as sort of a last ditch resort. No one can handle this kid, so we're going to hook him up and basically like electro-lobotomize him, is the energy in which they talk about it.
It is. Well, I mean, the kids talk about him getting lobotomized. They talk about him getting a piece of his brain pulled out with an ice hook or something like that.
Which is they do. Being lobotomized. Yeah. Mummy style, yes.
Well, I mean, it's not
very far off. No.
Not very far off. They basically stick an ice pick in your eye socket. So it's not. Well.
No, ma'am. Don't you ever let them lobotomize me, guys.
Well, I mean, if you keep being unruly and sassy, I mean, that's what they do to women who are unruly and sassy and difficult to control, right?
Back in the daisies.
You're all of those things, Brittany. So I'm afraid the outlook's
the
not
ice
so
man's
good.
coming. Ice pick man's coming.
And this time it's not Sharon Stone. The ECT treatments, unfortunately, are another thing that is extremely helpful in the right cases that gets misrepresented harmfully all the time. But also partially because it's been earned, because back in the 60s and things, it was used harmfully.
Yeah.
And that if not used compassionately, we could get someone who is severely damaged from it, like we see happen in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which that scene in that movie is probably more harmful to anyone seeking mental health services in the present day who think that that's still what it's like, which it's not.
Yeah.
But looking at, ECT being used as a threat of thing, ECT can be very helpful, particularly for people who are severely depressed. I have seen it in several clients who would have met the criteria for emotional disturbance. Something weird is happening that is impacting them across multiple things. It's due to so very many things that it can't be pinpointed as a single thing. So even one diagnosis won't cover it, which is probably a more appropriate use of emotional disturbance. And looking at it, these clients tried all sorts of things and eventually needed something that helped rewire the way that their brain was functioning at the moment. And it worked, and it worked wonders. A couple of people needed a few rounds of it, but when things get irresponsibly represented, it causes damage, and it causes people not to want to seek potentially viable avenues of treatment, which I see all the time as someone that uses clinical hypnosis, that sometimes I have to spend a half a session working through debunking. No, you're not going to cluck like a chicken.
Yeah.
No, you're not going to give me your bank account numbers. No. I feel like I'm singing, and now I'm going to write a parody that is going to no scrubs about hypnosis. That's happening, guys.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Look for it on our Patreon.
Yeah, because you're right. It's these treatments people have understandably come to massively distrust them, and they should, based on, like we've been talking about, like the history of these treatments. And so when people do need them, they feel disinclined because of that, and they don't understand quite what it is. And hopefully they find a clinician that they trust, who can help them trust it if they feel like they need it. And so in the context in which we understand ACT, would it be appropriate for our little Sam?
No.
No, absolutely not. The people I've worked with a couple people who've undergone ECT several times, and it's exactly what Ben is describing. Severe, when depression is so severe that people are almost catatonic, is the way, a part of a way that I've seen it used. It has been helpful for the people that I worked with as well, and that. Well, I don't think we don't know enough about Sam anyway. Also, no, because it's trauma related. It's like what's important for him is relational. We're not seeing a kid who is noticeably suicidal in any way. Like really, there would have to be a lot more things going on for ECT to even be considered. And also the way that they use it in the movie is just like as a threat. As a threat and and also as something that all the people who are talking about it don't know about it in any context besides the scary versions that have been shown more than one time on TV.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, and I think the sad part of this case is he probably would have been given it because basically in the 60s, the mental health medication available was Haldol, Thorazine, which are heavy duty antipsychotic drugs, and ECT, because even PTSD wouldn't have been remotely considered for him yet because it was still called shell shock pretty much.
Yeah, he hadn't gone to war, so how could he have PTSD?
Mm-hmm.
Correct. Well, the term didn't even come about by this time yet. It didn't come up until after Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the things that Sam is dealing with are not things that can be medicated away. You can't medicate an unstable home environment. You can't medicate trauma. You can somewhat medicate the ramifications of it. And they're looking for, which happens a lot with kids, especially back in the day, or just in general back in the day, is they're trying to find the answer that's going to nip all this shit in the bud because they don't want to take the time and the energy and they don't have the resources or perceived resources to really tackle what's going on with Sam, which is he'd be a kid where I would be like, I want to see him in the same home, in a stable environment for at least a year straight before I talk about this again, even in a whisper. That would be my response to social services if that came up.
Right. Ooh, I just had a thought. The Queen's Gambit covered this really well. Like seeing like kind of the approach to mental health and just like this one touch all
benzoed out or whatever.
Yep. The kids are all being benzoed out like, well, if we just give them tranquilizers, they'll be fine because they'll be calm.
And then there won't be
a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yep.
Which is why people still don't trust medication and mental health services to this day is because of the lingering impact of the way that it was inappropriately utilized in these situations.
And hence why there's a podcast.
Yes.
Because medications like Thorazine and like Haldol, anything like those meds do make people feel really sleepy and tired. And people often say, I don't want to become a zombie like those people that I see are on those meds. And like, guys with depression, no one's giving you Thorazine.
Yeah.
I talk to my clients all the time about the types of medications that usually have some kind of response like that. Is not something that you would get put on because you're not psychotic. You're not hearing things. You're not seeing things. You don't have any of and also if it was that intense, that would not be the first thing that you should be worried about. That those medications are given regularly, definitely to people who do need them, and they are effective when managed appropriately. But in terms of, they just didn't have anything else, but they also just fucked it up so royally. It's hard because the medication thing and not wanting to be medicated like a zombie is something that I get all the time. Mm-hmm. Still.
Yep. Me too. And it's like people don't know that things like the modern medications like Latuda and Abilify and Remeron exist that do not have that effect while can still treat even the more serious things. But even among those drugs that I'm mentioning, none of those are appropriate for either of these kids.
Mm-hmm.
And ECT, none of that. I mean, we just don't have enough information, haven't seen them in any sort of interventions to see how they respond to it. But something like ECT or anything like that is a late stage treatment intervention for most people when the depression has been what's called like treatment and medication resistant. It's not a first option response because it does have memory implications. Most of the time it's temporary, but there are risks and it's a higher risk procedure, but it's not something that would be considered in modern day for either of these kids, even remotely at this point in time. In the 60s, when I wasn't alive then, but from, our research on mental health and our education, we know that this was something that threat is not empty at this point in time.
Well, if you want to hear more, listen to our Shutter Island episode where we go to town on the time period and its treatment of mental health in these very specific ways.
Absolutely.
So I think now we will move on to treatment.
But before we do that, we must break.
All right. So treatment. I can go first. I definitely think prognostically for the best outcome for both of these kids post running away is some sort of what I would call like wraparound treatment. And by that, I mean something in which they are being seen individually and being seen in a family therapy type of way, or at least their parents also getting, by parents, I mean Suzy's parents and then Bruce Willis's character, getting also FaceTime with a therapist in some capacity, either family therapy with Suzy and Sam, or parent coaching is what it's sometimes called, which is basically family therapy without the kid present. Because one, obviously with Bruce Willis, he's just going to need parenting support because he's, I assume, never parented before. And so one, maybe needing some support as a new single parent and kind of knowing what to do. And then also maybe getting a lot of psychoeducation around what it's like to work with a kid who's gone through trauma, who has been living in a few homes. He might display some behaviors that don't quite make sense. When I would do foster care work with foster parents, it would, or like anyone who was taking care of a child who wasn't their biological child. Like, so sometimes it would be like grandparents, uncles and aunts and stuff, is just really getting them to like let go of things making sense. And by that, I mean, if he's hoarding a bunch of food in his room, can we let that slide? Because that's a very common one where parents get very confused with me of like, we feed him 3 times a day. Like he's never been without a meal. Why am I finding cans of beans under his bed? And I say, you're feeding him now. He doesn't know when you will dump him. And he's still, you have to let him be skeptical as long as he needs to be skeptical about this living arrangement. And all you need to do as a parent is be consistent, be available, and know what you're getting into. And if you're having a hard time, if you're struggling with their behavior, they don't need to know about that. You talk to me or you talk to your own support system, but try your best to have a consistent, like positive regard towards him, unconditional. If you're really committed to being there for him, you got to really be committed. And so sometimes that means as the parent, coach, therapist, sometimes I'm just a place to vent too. Like, I don't know what's going on. I'm really stressed out. And so sometimes my job can be a bit more on the therapist side for the parents, while also helping them understand what's going on. And then giving them like coaching part of it, like tips and tricks for how to respond or affirming the way they are responding. Like a good behavior that Hannah and I were talking about when we watched the movie is when he gives him a little beer and how that's really inappropriate. And I could see a parent like him even telling me that, like as part of the story, that like we like split a beer. And so I would, instead of jumping down his throat.
They didn't split it. He gave him like, go ahead.
Yeah, like a drink of it.
Yeah.
Instead I would be like, okay, so I don't think it's a great idea to give him substances because of his age and his brain development and yada, yada. And I can understand the sentiment of like the bonding activity that is like, you've had a hard day. We both had hard days. You want to crack open a cold one? Like I get that in that moment, he was trying to demonstrate respect. And so my job would not to be making him feel bad, but just be like, I get it. And what's a different way we could create the same closeness without, just don't give him a beer. And so like that would be my kind of role. And also with Suzy's parents, they would be tougher in that I think they definitely need more like, I think with Sam, it could definitely be more parent coaching where maybe Sam's not involved. I think with Suzy's parents, it might be split. It could even be like something where they see a family therapist and then they see a parent coach and then Suzy is therapy. Because I think as we've already established, her parents don't do a great job of regulating themselves and much less knowing how to support her in regulating. And so I think it would be really hard to get to crack the nut that is her parents, in that you guys need to change up the way that you are engaging with her. It's not just her fault. She's not just a problem child. Like I mentioned before, it would be a lot of hard conversations of how are you demonstrating to her how to be regulated? How are you showing her good communication skills? When she's upset, how are you listening to her? If she only feels heard when she's screaming, why? And so it would require them to hear a lot of hard truths from me that I think might be kind of tricky because of their barriers. And so they might also be parents that I would very kindly and firmly suggest, recommend, require that they also go to individual therapy. So like that would be a household where everybody should be in therapy. Do I think that they would take me up on that? Maybe not, because they're talking about being up your own butts. Because obviously, like I said, her dad is dealing with some suicidality. Like we didn't even mention at the very end of the movie, he's like, sometimes I wish the roof would fly off and suck me out. And so there's a lot going on in that household where we can't just treat Suzy like she's a problem in a vacuum. And so I think for that family to work, we need like what I said, like wraparound care. And her family has to be willing to engage with that appropriately. And I think they'll really struggle to not just want to put Suzy in a box of like, she's got problems. She's our troubled child. I also don't know quite in the 60s, because I didn't exist then, like also what that looked like. And if I was asking them something that seemed really preposterous, because it could be for the time period. But anyway, that was my thoughts with them, because I think individually with Suzy, it would just be a lot of coping skills, I think, processing, but then also teaching her skills. But then I think parents would have to play a big role in encouraging and modeling those coping skills. And I think she's getting old enough that she could maybe help herself. And it'd be really hard in that household unless the parents change. It would be really hard for her to make a lot of progress. So that's kind of my thoughts with treatment.
I'll go next. I think I mentioned it earlier, so I'm going to talk on it now, is that the relational approach is the probably only approach I would take at this point in time with either kid. Both kids are relatively the same. They're mirrors of each other, even though they've been through different things, in that one has gone through loss of parents, the other has physically, the other has gone through loss of parents mentally.
Yeah.
I think that is why they see each other in the way that they do, and why they're able to be so accepting of each other, quirks and all, and just understand that, hey, there's things wrong with me, there's things wrong with you. We're going to make this work, even though we're mimicking the characters in the stories we read or the things that we've seen from our parents when they were alive. As I'm going to assume in my head, the headcanon that exists here is that Sam's parents were very loving and loved each other very much, and then were gone, and that he doesn't seek out the same type of media that she does because he saw that and knew that exists. And I don't know that she ever knew that existed, and why she seeks out stories that allow her to escape. And
also that statement she makes of like, I wish I was an orphan. And he takes that beat where you can tell that he's pulling himself back. And he goes, I love you, but you don't know what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. Which I think feeds into what you're presuming too.
Yep, I think so. And looking at either of them, I think I would want to work with them on doing exactly the things that we see Captain Sharp doing, aka Bruce Willis, because we already covered that. He's just going to be Bruce Willis. As long as he's not John McClane, he's Bruce Willis. Mm-hmm. And I actually like him better when he's not John McClane. The things that we see happen that work are when the adults talk with the kids from a standpoint that just lets them know you're going to be accepted. You're not going to be shamed. You're not going to be cast out. We're going to talk about it. We may have to talk about changing behaviors and that things that happened weren't okay, and we have to deal with that. But that doesn't mean that you're bad. That doesn't mean that you're going to be told you can't stay here anymore. It just means that what happened isn't okay. Mm-hmm. And it's going to take a lot of time for that to happen. We're talking 6 to 18 months, working close It's going to have to be a committed therapeutic relationship, or again, working with kids I did in residential, or not 13 months or so, but it's going to take time to earn their trust. It's going to take more time for them to tell you you've earned their trust than it's going to take to earn it. And you're going to have to consistently prove against every test that they throw you that they can't throw you off the scent, and that they can't sniff you out for being full of bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't truly love these kids and show them that I'm going to be here regardless of what you say to me, regardless of what you said to anybody else, that this is going to be a place where we can talk about it and work through it, they're going to smell the bullshit and they're going to shut down.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what these kids need, is they need some understanding. They need some recognition that they're not bad kids. They probably don't have any kind of serious mental illness that's going to persist throughout the rest of their life. That it looks to me like both of their situations are more circumstantial, granted tragic circumstances, but are more based on that they developed because the situation developed, and not they developed and then the situation developed around the illness that developed, because that looks very different. And I've worked in both settings and with both situations, and one does not look like the other. It is very clear when the whole family system changes around an illness instead of when something happens, doesn't get addressed, especially when it gets like swept under the rug or happens in secret, and one person finds out and then is tasked with keeping that secret. These things don't look the same, and they don't need to be treated the same, and that we do a grave injustice to people who are having an understandable reaction to just the worst circumstances possible, lumping them in with people who are having medically and chemically based issues, and that this person has something wrong with them, as opposed to something really bad happened to this other person. Like, we can't equate those because they're not the same thing. And with love and trust and compassion, you see good results more often than you don't, so long as you can start making the changes to make them feel safe. Because like Hannah was talking about, all those things that she was listing off about, like, well, they could be here and they could be there and they could be here. All of those things create a condition of threat, period. The minute that kid feels threatened, they're going to shut down. So I would want to spend time getting to know that kid. I would have more diffuse boundaries than I usually do. Let them in to meet me a little bit more than I typically do with some clients. Some clients, I kind of keep things in the way that we're traditionally trained to, which is to kind of keep our lives a little bit distant from it. When you read that people have been through a thing like this, they have to be able to see that they're working with a human being that gets them and has maybe lived a little bit of life too. And that is why Sam opened up to Captain Sharp the way that he did, is because he let him see, I have been hurt too. Not in the same ways as you, but I've been hurt too. And he let him into that. And that's what a relational approach looks like, and is what is clinically appropriate for both these kids.
So both of you stole all the ideas that I had, that I have been thinking about. And so now I don't have anything. The only thing that I can think of is how important it is for you to build a relationship with a kid who has been through a lot of stuff, just like what Ben was saying. And so some of those sessions, and I guess really what I'm going to do is just give you some of the questions that I ask kids, the way that I ask them, and the way that I show that I care, and the way that I show that I'm interested, which may be something that you normally would think of and it might not be. So one of the things that I usually do is ask them what their favorite thing is. What is your favorite thing that you like to do? And then I ask a lot of questions about that thing. Kind of like, well, what is that like? Or like, so do you win that? Or is it something that you play with friends? Is it something that you can do by yourself? Do you have something you like to do with friends? And some kids can answer those questions. Some kids are just like, kind of like, no, I don't know. I can't really give me anything else to go off of, which is also totally fine. But Ben, what you said about having to share a little bit about yourself, that's definitely something that I use on a regular basis. And not as when I was a kid, your age, blah, 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 none of that shit, but more of I'm the oldest in my family. or something like I'm the oldest in my family, something like I talk about my pets. I talk about usually Marvel or Star Wars to see if there's anything that they know, if they read comics, if they don't read comics, if there's any shows that they really like. And then sometimes I'll be like, okay, well, I'm going to watch that show. And so we could talk about it because I want to understand what you're saying when you tell me about this thing that you really enjoy. And that's a part of the relational approach. That is a part of getting to know them, helping them understand that I'm here and that I'm interested in what they have to say. And I really want to know, like, I'm not just asking these questions because it's like on the list of questions that I ask. I ask because I'm interested in a lot of things, and also asking kids about what they like and what they like about it. You have some of the most interesting conversations you could just never think of when they can answer some of those things. That also gives them time to show a part of themselves that normally maybe, I wouldn't see because they might feel like, well, my parents said that I was in trouble. And so now I'm seeing you. And so they're not going to want to tell me, all the different things that they might have going on, or just the different things that they're thinking all the time. And one last time, I will mention that I give the parents a pretty big lecture about what it's going to be like. And I'm talking more about working with the kid individually. And that it's really important for them to get to know me and for me to get to know them, and that I don't know how long that's going to take. And that a part of that is letting the parents know that I'm not going to come in with an agenda. I will give you updates if I think they're necessary. This is how confidentiality works with me and also with the state, because there's laws about it. And I really clarify all those things. And then I have the same conversation with the kid. Sometimes I can have this conversation with the parent and the kid in the room, or sometimes I have the conversation with the kid, with each person separately, but try to really make sure this is all transparent in terms of the things that I have to share and the things that I'm not going to. Because the relational pieces, that is all stuff that I wouldn't need to share with the parent. Like I'm not, I wouldn't be giving updates about that. So that's really the only thing I feel like I can add, because I was thinking pretty much all the same things that you were both saying. So I don't have anything else for treatment.
Well, like you were saying, Hannah, like we mentioned before, she's really into books. Books say a lot about how she sees herself. She would be a good kid to ask, what's your favorite book? Tell me about that book. Or even just say, like, if I really need to get to know you, what would be the perfect book for me to read to really get to know you? Or even reading a book with her, like, or alongside her, or even making a story of herself. Like sometimes you do that where you have them write their own story, which, in the kind of maybe even in the context of those books. So yeah, you're exactly right. So with final thoughts, I will go quickly. Like I said, I love this movie. It's one of my favorite movies, period. I love Wes Anderson movies though, so that's not hard for me to love it. When Hannah and I watched it, we watched Fantastic Mr. Fox right afterwards, which is also one of my favorite movies, which might be my favorite Wes Anderson movie. But I would also highly recommend that movie too. But yeah, I love this movie. I'll watch it probably a billion more times. I find it to be a very cozy movie. And like we've mentioned before, it does a really good job of holding a lot of empathy for kids who have been sort of ostracized by the world in certain ways. So I will throw to Ben or Hannah.
I'll go. I have mixed feelings on Wes Anderson movies in general. I hate his use of jump cuts. I just hate them. They like disorient me and it unnerves me a little bit. Feels weird. I know it's a style and that some people really like it, but I don't care for the camera work in his movies a lot. That being said, the storytelling and the use of humor and the pointing things right on their face and the way he does that through satirical things and just images or in quick little vignettes is brilliant. And I do enjoy that about this film. I think this is a very emotionally intelligent film. I think it's really good. It's not really my jam, so I probably won't seek it out, but I did appreciate watching it, and I think that it has a lot of good messages. Really enjoyed having been a Boy Scout, which, side note, got bought by the Church of the Latter-day Saints at some point in time, that they really called on the face the way that Boy Scouts also kind of got inappropriately intertwined with religion. Kind of just slid Jason Schwartzman in to just kind of go like, beep, let's just call that right on its face too, as we cover this. Scouting got really, really weird and really creepy for multitude of reasons, and that on top of all of the other things, they found a way to sneak that in and make fun of it too. chef's kiss of brilliance on that one. But ultimately, like I have mixed feelings on this movie. I think it's good, but it's not really my jam. So I think everybody should probably watch it. But if Wes Anderson is not your jam, totally get it.
I love this movie. I think I saw it twice in the movie theaters when it came out. I had actually never seen The Fantastic Mr. Fox. I've watched it a couple of times now. So it was really fun to watch that right after. But I love this movie. And I definitely will watch it more. There's a lot of acting is good. There's just a lot of parts of this that just really work. And the way that Wes Anderson gives kids a voice that feels different than the way that other people give kids voices in media in general, kind of. So that's a part of the reason why I love his stuff so much. So I'll definitely watch this movie again.
All right. Well, on that positive note, like I said, you can find us at Patreon. If you'd like to be a patron of us, you can find us at TeePublic. If you'd like to purchase any merch of ours, you can find us at Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Popcorn Psychology. You can find us on Twitter at popcorn_psych. You can always email us at popcornpsychology@gmail.com if you want to share a recommendation with us or a suggestion or have a question or anything like that. You can always leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcast. We read all your reviews, so be nice to us, please, or we will cry. And but also thank you for anyone who's taking the time out to give us some of those recent 5-star reviews that we've seen. They're really lovely. And so we will catch you all later.